The system of recording here still confuses me, so we'll continue with the second night of hazing in Dartmouth. Having experienced the previous one, I got on some shoes and grabbed a blanket and went out into the hallway waiting to be paraded around for the singing of songs, but it was a much more dramatic situation. They were taking freshmen and pushing them into the common showers where the temperature was so high that steam was coming out of the showers, and somebody grabbed a hold of my blanket to take it away and pushed me down that direction. And I wasn't about to go along with that, and being half asleep, I grabbed my blanket and gave it a yank and sent this guy spinning down the hall in the other direction. I was somewhat pleased with myself, but was immediately pounced on by some big guys who almost picked me up and said, "Hey, we got a tough guy here, and we're taking him for a ride with those other guys." So I wasn't a tough guy, so I just went along with them, and they put me in the back of a car and told me to put the blanket over my head so I couldn't tell where we were going. But they rounded up a couple of other guys in the meantime, and one of them was very violent, and I learned later that he'd already knocked out somebody in the second floor above where our room was, and they were really giving him a hard time. Shoved him in next to me, and he wanted to attack these guys, and we were already starting to roll, and I said, "Don't be crazy. We could have an accident in the car and we'd all be wiped out." Having been there for a week or so before that, I had some pretty good idea of what turns were being made and about where we were being taken, and it seemed to be out to the north, beyond the college campus. And they took us into a barnyard that I was able to peek out and notice where we were turning. And we drove in behind this barn, and they pulled us out of the car, and they left that guy there and put the other two of us back in the car, and they let the other fellow out at the base of the driveway or barnyard road, and they turned in a direction that was supposed to confuse me, and after about a mile they let me out. And I had a pretty good idea what direction I needed to go, so I set off with my blanket around me. Luckily I had on shoes, and I hadn't walked far before another car came by, and it was a upperclassman who'd been out on a date and knew all about the hazing and thought it was pretty amusing, picked me up and brought me back to the campus, and actually pretty close to where my dorm was, Massachusetts Hall. So I walked in, and my roommates were trying to put the place in some kind of order, and they said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "It's a long story. I'll tell you about it in the morning." We put the stuff back together, and they had broken some chairs and thrown a desk out the window. It had been a pretty rough situation, but they hadn't been hurt. And we got through that. That had been a bad night because we had heard that they had taken some of the more resistant freshmen on some rides that were even more disturbing than mine. One fellow was tied to the bridge down at White River Junction without any clothes on. He developed pneumonia, and was in the Dick's house, which was our infirmary, for about a week before he recovered. Another fellow was upstairs in our dorm, who actually was a sophomore, that was wearing a letter sweater that the other letterman didn't think he deserved, and they got into a fight about it and knocked him down, and he hit his head against a radiator, and make a long story short, he did not survive. This led to a total cessation of hazing at Dartmouth. So I had the great privilege of being the last class that was hazed. The dorm living was not too bad. I had a little radio, and my roommate had a full hi-fi system with a lot of records. I enjoyed his Dixieland music, which I hadn't heard before. And there were some ballads and things that were popular at the time. And I had done some singing, so quickly memorized a lot of these songs, and had a lot of fun with them. The dorm was not really ideal for studying, though, as you might imagine, and it turned out that the library became a source of quiet, and there were a number of areas in the library that were good for this, and that's where I wound up doing most of my serious studying. There was also assignments in general subjects like government, where there were a lot of reference materials in the basement of the library, and they weren't something you could check out, so you had to go there to read them. And the amount of reading was pretty heavy in those general subjects. The roommates I had were good guys. One was Al Riegelman. He was on the swim team and had a friend named Moose Palitz, who was a great big heavy guy. They wanted to get into football, but he preferred the swimming. Actually, he was a butterfly breaststroke champion, and became one of my acquaintances. Al himself was a backstroke expert. He was not really a close friend, was always busy with other guys, but he did arrange for a blind date for me for Winter Carnival that year. And I might say that dating at Dartmouth was a rare and splendid thing, and if it wasn't splendid, it was very depressing. The date I had for Winter Carnival was a nice little gal, but not very enthusiastic about anything, and so it was kind of a negative experience, and I didn't bother to do that anymore. There was a nursing school in town, and that served us for occasional date to a movie or something simple. And some of the older guys had cars and would go down to Colby Junior, which was a girls' school for a 2-year program at that time. I understand it's a 4-year college now. There was a general attitude of being so close. There was not a great deal of respect for the Colby Junior College or the girls compared to the farther away Smith, Holyoke, and Vassar girls. But interestingly, there were more marriages to Colby Junior girls than there were any of the others. My other roommate was Tom Fenton, who you may have heard was a CBS announcer. Maybe it was NBC. I'm not sure. At any rate, he was in charge of the European News Center and occasionally was on TV. He worked under some of the bigger names. At the time, he had just finished prep school in the Baltimore area, and this had given him some academic and environmental advantages, particularly with his brothers having gone to Dartmouth. That took me a few months to acquire that degree of comfort. His home was in Baltimore, and on one of our breaks, he took me home with him. We had swapped home visits. This was where I first saw a professional level of badminton. This had been always kind of a picnic game to me, and we went to a match where this was a lightning speed sport with crushing blows. It was pretty amazing to see. There was a party while I was there, a dance party in Washington, which was considered right in the same neighborhood, I guess. And Tom arranged a date with a cousin of his for me to have as a blind date, telling me that she was pretty fast and I'd have a great time. Well, she was a little bit on that side. I remember her telling me when I was dancing with her that she had to dance with some of those other boys, and that I would get my pleasures on the ride home. So I put up with that, and it was a very pleasant ride home. And she invited me to a party that she was giving at her own home a couple of nights later. And this was my second exposure to, I don't know, mini riots. We had left the party early, probably a reasonable hour, but we heard later that there were some of the boys that were there had become probably intoxicated and started smashing furniture and throwing things out the window. And we heard that her mother was a single mother and in great distress after this party. But we went over and tried to help straighten things out and make it as good as possible, as our cousin could be. Not entirely an eye-opener, but about the closest I'd come to this kind of behavior. And I could not understand how this was a necessary or even pleasurable experience for the perpetrators. Tom was a fellow Episcopalian and an acolyte there in the church, almost on campus, where Reverend Leslie Hodder was the minister. He was a great help to me because at Dartmouth and probably most colleges there was a real all-out attempt to make you clear your mind of any previous beliefs or even attitudes, to give you an open mind. And this led, of course, to doubts about your religion and beliefs. And I, helping out there as an occasional acolyte, asked the Reverend if I could talk to him about that. And his support was excellent. I remember in particular he had said, where was I in my belief? And I said, well, I still believe in the Creator, but I'm not so sure about the story of his only son. And he said, well, why don't you just look at him as probably the best man that ever lived, and study him in that regard in the Bible. Look to see what he has had to say, what he did. And he says at some point you'll feel like you're on the wrong side of the mountain, but you're getting closer to the top, and then at some point you'll find yourself on the other side, believing completely. And I took that for what it was worth, and followed that advice, and it worked. I must have been another year or so before I felt strong again, and then I purposely avoided the discussions and philosophical bull-throwing sessions, really, that tend to be a common thing in college. The Reverend Hodder and his wife always had a little breakfast for the early risers, and English muffins were the primary goodie, along with some different drinks. And I had never had English muffins before, and these were made and kept warm in the oven, which was quite delicious in a very homey atmosphere. And so I continued to stay close to that couple. And actually, when the years went by and I was ready for marriage, I told my wife-to-be about this man, and how if she didn't have any particular preference, it would be a good thing for me and maybe both of us if we had our wedding under his leadership in the Dartmouth Chapel. And we agreed to do that. And it was very strengthening and helpful to me. But that was my early contact with them. At the same time, there was a Baptist church on campus, and my mother having been Baptist, I visited there a few times and found this a much more social atmosphere, and there were actual socials and in the evenings once a week. The other element for religious experience at Dartmouth was the chapel. At 10 o'clock every morning, there was a 15-minute break for chapel and another 15 minutes to get on to your next class. These sessions were not particularly uplifting. They were more academic than they were faith-oriented. The advantages that Tom Benton had included an ability to write that I had not developed very well, and he gave me some tips, and my English teacher did as well. When I was unhappy with less than an A, and it seemed that my abilities were in condensing a book into an outline or synopsis, but expanding a single topic into an essay was not my strength. But I learned to do it satisfactorily. It never was something that I felt entirely comfortable with. But I was very good on detail. And of course this helped me in the sciences. And interestingly, in this Shakespearean English course, I had come in with a B to finals, and he had announced that the final was going to be a multiple choice. And he'd said to me that this was my chance to show my strengths, and So I was well prepared and had enjoyed the course and had committed a great deal of Shakespeare to memory in the process, and not necessarily to recite it, but to recognize the origin. And at any rate, there were some 100 questions, and as the class gathered the next day, the professor announced that there had been somebody who got higher than anybody had on the similar test in the past 10 years, and it turned out to be me. So I got my A after all. Dartmouth Medical School was a 2-year school at the time, and they were interested in the pre-meds that were strong candidates, and they gave us some counseling, as I mentioned earlier, and this allowed on a special program to those who were doing very well academically to condense 4 years into 3 pre-med, and then moving into the first year of Dartmouth Medical School. At the end of that 3 years, maybe the best students signed up for this program, and actually this improved our guidance from these professors, and some 21 students were chosen, 18 of them from Dartmouth. Interestingly, myself and 3 others from my social fraternity were included in that 18. The problem for me was I had interviewed at Harvard Medical School and did not find this to be a desirable place for me. The attitude there was very aloof. When I went in to the assigned interviewer, he was standing looking out the window and never did turn and face me, told me to have a seat, which I did, and after seemed like eternity, he came over and sat down behind his desk and started grilling me. The questions were legitimate, and I answered them well, and actually eventually was accepted there, but I didn't like the attitude. So I was a little concerned about a 2-year medical school at Dartmouth, because practically all the 21 students transferred to Harvard at the end of 2 years. So I went down to Yale and found an entirely different attitude that I'll go into when we come to that stage. At any rate, it was much more appealing, still accepted me after 3 years, and that, of course, as you know, is where I spent my graduate schools, 4 years in medicine. The second year at Dartmouth was a more social one. Freshmen were not allowed to be pledged for fraternities, but sophomores were, and there was a week where you were supposed to go around and visit all the fraternities that you were interested in, and then you would get calls to come back if they liked you. And I think it was called, I can't remember, Pledge Week or something like that. At any rate, the experience was generally pleasant. I had an uncle who had been in Sigma Alpha Epsilon, so I went over to that but discovered that everybody there was on the ski team, and I didn't know how to ski at all. I wound up at Sigma Phi Epsilon, which was a smaller fraternity, but the primary attraction there was not this pressure to be a drinking buddy, and I was a teetotaler, and remained so throughout college and med school, even well into my residency. At any rate, they didn't care whether a pledge was interested in drinking or not, and probably half the fraternity were not interested. So this had a real appeal to me, and several of us, as I mentioned before, 4 of us pre-meds pledged that fraternity and had a very happy time with it. The hazing was minimal. Maybe it always had been in comparison to what I related from the freshman year, but it involved pretty local things like having to fill up a bathtub with a shot glass, walking back and forth to the water in the sink. Then some exploratory trips out into the nearby communities where we're supposed to find clues and that sort of thing. Nothing embarrassing, nothing dangerous. The next year I was in charge of the pledge class and continued that tradition. At the end of the freshman year, we learned that we had no priorities whatsoever as sophomores in getting housing on campus in the dormitories. Al Riegelman went with his friends, and Tom and I went to a Quonset hut down at the bottom of the hill near the river. There was a whole community of those, mainly for the GIs, who had come back on the GI Bill and were married, and some with children. And these had been converted into like little apartments. And for the first semester, we moved into that, but then he moved into his fraternity house, and I moved into a single dorm room for the quiet study advantages. That was in Topliff Hall, which was right across from the building that housed the band, which was becoming my strong extracurricular activity. I remember when we were down the hill one time, I had a flat tire in that big old bicycle that I told you about earlier. I took it to college, and I had to haul that thing up the hill to get it repaired. And by the time I got to the town where breakfast could be arranged, I could hardly lift my hand to feed myself. My arm had gone numb carrying the front end of that bicycle all the way up the hill. At any rate, that was the environmental change. I did not choose to live in a fraternity, my fraternity house, because there was always too much activity, and I had learned to study best in a quiet environment. Via the fraternity, though, by just walking a couple blocks to it, I could have all the social activity I was interested in. And on weekends and special weekends, that involved some special dates, and my upperclassmen in the fraternity were oriented towards Smith College, and so I had a number of trips in that direction, and met a number of girlfriends, and none of them seemed to last. The old Florida girlfriend, as we noted before, had gone another direction. The situation improved in my junior year when I had a car. I think it would have been my sophomore year when there was a strong draft for the Korean War, and top student deferrals were available, and I was beginning to hit my stride academically, and had a recommendation to my draft board that I be deferred as a top student and a pre-medical student as well. Between the second and third year, I had a job in the Woodland paper mill that was arranged by knowing the father of a classmate who'd been also a Dartmouth man. He was in the management level. My job was to help with the herding of pulpwood down the river into a beltway that led to a huge barn-like structure that was called a debarker, that rolled these logs around and knocked the bark off and dumped it out one side, and the smooth pulpwood would come out the other. And occasionally those would clog up, and some of the old-timers would go out on this pile of pulpwood and pick it apart with pick poles, and this was very dangerous because it would suddenly collapse, and these fellows were very spry and very knowledgeable of how to protect themselves. And we were taught how to use the pick pole, which was probably, at least 20 feet long, to keep ourselves above the logs should we fall in, just in the ordinary movement of the logs down the river. I don't believe that happened to me, but I was pretty cautious. No one was seriously injured during my time there. I only worked there for 2 or 3 weeks because I was developing what proved to be carpal tunnel syndrome in both hands. I talked to the old-timers about it, and they said, oh yeah, they hadn't had any feeling in their hands for years. Well, as we noted earlier, this meant I was able to change over to a job in the yard, which wasn't a whole lot better. You never knew what was going to come for a need each day. One day you'd be shoveling gravel or sand, another day you'd be pulling nails out of boards, and another day the most fun was really taking limestone. Limestone is not a solid stone, so you'd have a large size stone to drop from a railway car, an open car, up on a trestle down onto a pile where they break into smaller stones about 1 foot in diameter. Then you put those into a hand car and push those into the furnace room, where they were unloaded as necessary as part of the chemical process of preparing the pulp for manufacturing paper. The experience was good and bad. It certainly was interesting. The bad was, as I noted, the likelihood of hand injury. The guy that arranged the job had always said Dartmouth and all college students were really soft compared to the guys that were working there. We thought we were pretty strong, but there's no question that the regular workers were hard as nails and could take just about anything. Then the third year, Dartmouth arrived, and I'll pick that up at another point.